walk into this room at your own risk, because it leads to the future. Not a future that will be, but one that might be. This is not a new world. It is simply an extension of what began in the old one. It has patterned itself after every dictator who has ever planted the ripping imprint of a boot on the pages of history since the beginning of time. It has refinements, technological advances, and a more sophisticated approach to the destruction of human freedom. But like every one of the superstates that preceded it, it has one iron rule. Logic is an enemy and truth is a menace.
Paris outragé, Paris brisé, Paris martyrisé.
In einem starken Heer liegt das einzige Unterpfand für ein eigenes Reich. Nicht auf Preußens Liberalismus sehen die anderen deutschen Staaten, sondern auf Preußens Macht. Denn nicht durch Reden und Majoritätsbeschlüsse werden die großen Fragen der Zeit entschieden. Das ist der Irrtum der Jahre 1848 und 49 gewesen, sondern durch Eisen und Blut.
This place ain't no such thing as civilized. It's man, so in love with greed, he has forgotten himself and found only appetites.
Welcome to the first episode of No Such Thing as Civilized. This is a bit weird for me because obviously as a white man in the 21st century, I have done podcasts before, but I've never done them by myself. So talking into the open abyss and ether while I sit here by myself is a bit weird. So please bear with me while I figure this out and try to do this in an entertaining way. This is not a series that I ever really anticipated in doing. It really came about from two things. The first is whenever I would read a history book or watch a history documentary, I would get in Discord with my friends and I would want to tell them about it. And it was really entertaining for them and they loved hearing about it because they loved hearing my passion for the topic and the way I would tell the stories. Because I absolutely love the unfiltered, uncensored brutality of history. I like the political side as well, but what I really love is the first-hand accounts of the men and women that are attached to historical events. So I would tell them what I've learned and they would love it, but they wish that it would be a little more fleshed out and cohesive, and most importantly, that it would be in a recorded form. So that's the first reason. The second reason is because I graduated from college with a degree in graphic design. I have been doing video editing and graphic design for 6 years, I would say. So graduated from college with a degree, and now I am working in IT, which is my real passion. So this is a good alternative to use those skills that I've developed through high school and college and my own free time. And I'm getting to do it through an avenue that I love, which is history. Before we get started, I do gotta say to anybody that's listening to this, probably Cher and Cass and my mom and Wyatt, maybe Zane as well. Thank you guys for listening to this. I don't know if this will get past my little echo chamber of the world, but if it does, thank you for deciding to click on this and listen to it, because it is unfortunately severely evident that not many people in today's world know their history or choose to learn it. That goes for both normal civilians and also, even more unfortunate, the politicians that run many countries around the world. And there's that famous saying, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. And not to fearmonger, but I feel that as we have those types of people in power and continue to raise generations that aren't informed on the events of history, that we're going to see our mistakes of the past come to fruition once again and be repeated as we move forward into future generations. There are going to be different parts of this episode that sound different when compared to each other. That's because I suck, and I'll record one part and then I'll look back at my notes and I'll say, oh shit, I forgot to mention this or that. So I'll go back and re-record it, but it'll be on a different day in a different room. So just bear with me. This first episode, we're trying shit out. Hopefully with future episodes, I will be secluded to one room for the entire recording. And hopefully the entire recording will be done in one day. But only God knows if I will be that prepared on a single day to regurgitate as much information as I can. Finally, before we get into the episode, I do just want to say really quick, shouts out to Cass, who does the quotes for this episode. I originally was going to do the quotes, but then I decided that I wanted to have a little bit of differentiation on who is talking to this episode, and I also plan on using actual recorded quotes in the future when we get to discuss some topics that are a little more modern and we are able to utilize recordings of people talking. So I didn't want to use AI because fuck AI. So I had my friend Cass, who is an amazing voice actor and can do so many different impressions. I had him do the quotes for this episode. Shouts out to him, and let's get into the episode. Today's topic is the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. This is an event I had never heard about. I originally wanted to start this series talking about the outbreak of World War I. And while I was diving deeper into the 5 causes of that war, which, if you didn't pay attention in school, are militarism, imperialism, nationalism, alliances, assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, I came across this event, and I was so taken aback by the fact that I had never once learned about it in all my years of schooling, because this is the story of the unification of Germany and the foundation of the Second German Reich that eventually becomes one of the belligerents in World War I and changes the world forever. So I thought, what better way to start this series than giving a little prelude into one of the causes of World War I, which we will move on to covering and expanding on even further. Because it's one thing to know history, it's another thing to know the context behind the history that you know. So this will offer some great context into the national identity of the belligerents in World War I, how the people viewed themselves and viewed their neighbors in Europe, and it will lay the foundation for the single most catastrophic and tremendous event that ushered in a new era of warfare and modernity around the entire globe. So before we get into the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, we need to roll it back a few years and look at the European geography that has changed up to that point. So going back to 1866, mainland Europe has about 6 major world powers in its landmass. You have the Second French Empire, the Kingdom of Spain, the Austrian Empire, the Ottoman Empire down in Asia Minor, the massive Russian Empire, which spans through Poland and then all the way over to China. Then you have the Kingdom of Prussia, which holds a lot of present-day Germany and half of Poland, and even reaches up to Lithuania along the coast of the Baltic Sea. Then you have the German Confederation, which is this very small association of 39 predominantly German-speaking sovereign states that was formed by the Congress of Vienna in 1850 to replace the Holy Roman Empire, which was dissolved in 1806 at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Now, around the German Confederation, you have other smaller duchies and principalities like the Duchy of Hesse, the Kingdom of Hanover, the Grand Duchy of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, the Kingdom of Wittenberg, the Grand Duchy of Baden, and the Kingdom of Bavaria, and the Kingdom of Saxony. Now, the German Confederation really wanted a unified Germany. So they aligned themselves with the Prussian Empire, which had been really making a name for themselves on the world stage throughout the 19th century. And in 1866, the Prussians go to war with the Austrian Empire. And it doesn't last very long. It actually only goes for about 7 weeks. And this strengthens the territory of the Kingdom of Prussia mightily, because through it, they get a little bit of Austria's territory in between Hamburg and Denmark. The German Confederation is dissolved, and the North German Confederation is formed. But then they also absorb the Kingdom of Hanover. Another outcome of the Austro-Prussian War was the transformation of the Austrian Empire into Austria-Hungary, which was still an empire, but it was now a multinational constitutional monarchy. So it was 2 sovereign states with a single monarch who was titled both the Emperor of Austria and the King of Hungary. So the North German Confederation is formed under the flag of the Kingdom of Prussia, but they still have a few holdouts before having a completely unified Germany. Obviously, there is Württemberg, Hesse, Kingdom of Bavaria, Kingdom of Saxony, and the Grand Duchy of Mecklenburg-Schwerin that they need to absorb into their atmosphere to become a unified state. Now, one of the officials of the Kingdom of Prussia and the North German Confederation realized that the only way to convince the remaining holdout duchies and principalities into joining the Confederation and making a united German state was war. And that man was Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. The French were starting to take notice of their rapidly developing neighbors, and they started getting a little worried. At this time, in terms of colonialism, France was still really battling it out for territory around the world with England, and they knew that eventually, if Prussia kept expanding, they would want to get to that point as well, and they wanted to stop that in its tracks. Noticing this, Otto von Bismarck realized to make the outlying duchies and principalities join the North German Confederation through their shared nationality that stems back to the Germanic people is to go to war with France. He saw it as inevitable that they needed to fight France in order to stir up this ethnic pride in the Germanic people throughout these duchies and principalities to fight together and eventually unite together as one. So the French, being worried, went around to the different empires and kingdoms around the area and tried to organize a resistance against the Kingdom of Prussia. The issue is nobody wanted to join them. And that's for one specific reason, and that's that nobody liked the fucking French. I mean, you look at the time here, this is 1866. 52 years before this, the French were wreaking havoc across all of Europe with the Napoleonic Wars and Napoleon Bonaparte just devastating the entire continent, going all the way over to Russia before being pushed back. So they had created for themselves a reputation of being warmongers and conquerors that the other empires of Europe really wanted to keep suppressed as it had been for the last 52 years. Obviously, they'd had territories down in Africa and around the world, but in terms of territory in mainland Europe, not much has changed for them, and they wanted to keep it that way. So, when thinking about the possibility of this incoming war between France and Prussia, the other European forces believed that it would be better for them if Prussia won that, because they're still an up-and-coming empire that doesn't have all of their stuff together yet, and if they won the war, they would be easier to defeat. And if the French won the war, it would extend their territory from the Atlantic all the way through Central Europe up to Russia along the Baltic Sea once again. And they just couldn't have that. So France was on their own. The inciting incident for this whole war comes when the Spanish government is looking for a new monarch for the Spanish throne, which has been vacant since 1868. And they offer it to a prince named Leopold von Hohenzollern. Now, Leopold is initially hesitant to assume the throne. He was actually offered it 3 times before he finally accepted. When news of him accepting the role reaches Paris on July 3rd, the French lose it. They are frantic because Leopold is connected to the Prussian royal house. They see it as unacceptable that the Prussians might also hold the Spanish throne and fear that an alliance between the two thrones could result in an encirclement of the French Empire. However, while that makes sense on the surface, France has an understandable fear of foreign allegiance and encirclement around their country. It's not that cut and dry, and that's for one reason, and that's that Leopold is not fully Prussian. So the House of Hohenzollern was a branch of the ruling Prussian house that was actually annexed by the Prussian throne in 1850. Also, the House of Hohenzollern was Roman Catholic, while the ruling Prussian house was Protestant. Leopold was chosen because he was Roman Catholic, which was required in order to be the Spanish monarch. So, the French start pushing down diplomatic pressure onto Leopold and his family, telling them, you cannot accept this crown. You cannot take it. And Leopold's father actually rescinds his candidacy on his son's behalf. However, that wasn't enough for the French. The French foreign minister takes it a step further. He demands that the Prussians never again support a member of Leopold's house for the candidacy of the Spanish throne. They send a French ambassador to meet Prussian King Wilhelm I during his holiday recess in Ems to discuss this demand, and obviously the Prussian king outright refuses. He then orders his advisor to send a telegram to Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, notifying him of his decision. Once the Chancellor receives the telegram, he revises the wording to make it appear that the Prussian king had insulted the ambassador. Engineering war is Otto von Bismarck's bread and butter. This is his third war that he has engineered to unify Germany under Prussian leadership. The first was against Denmark in 1864, the second against Austria in 1866, and now against France in 1870. It is a testament to his core belief that Germany would be unified into a national state through one avenue: blood and iron. If you are able to decipher German in any way, you probably heard that in the beginning at the intro where you heard the guy talking in German. He said it at the end. That is a audio clip from the 1940 German film Bismarck, where the Chancellor gives his famous iron and blood speech to the Prussian parliament as they discuss going to war to complete the unification of Germany. So he willingly revises the wording to make it seem like his king was insulting the French ambassador. And then he sends it out to all Prussian diplomats on July 13th. This is going to be known as the Ems Dispatch. Once this dispatch hits Parisian newspapers the following day, the French lose their mind. They cannot believe they have seen such disrespect, because all of these countries, it's just like America today. Everybody, in America says, oh, we're the best, we're the best. That is not a new concept that came about with America. That has been something that has been around for centuries. And the French are one of those people that see themselves as the best. And so to see this, this less than amalgamation of different duchies and kingdoms all under one flag is insulting to them. And 6 days later, they declare war on Prussia. Now, skipping ahead a few months, it is January 1871, and surprisingly, the Franco-Prussian War is almost done. It had only been waging for 6 months, but even within the first 2 months, the victors had been decided. The armies of the North German Confederation, who were under the leadership of the Kingdom of Prussia, have just flat out decimated the French Second Empire's army with remarkable speed, primarily due to, surprisingly, their numerical superiority, exceptional training, leadership, and effective utilization of modern technology, which is a funny thing to say because they're still fighting with swords and muskets and horses and carriages and 19th century artillery. But this just totally shocks the entire world. They thought that not only would the French win this war, but that it would be a prolonged war, that it would go on for years. And then fast forward 6 months, and the French are as good as dead. At the onset of this war at the beginning of August, Napoleon III and the French's only plan for this entire war was to start in Lorraine, cross the Rhine, and fight their way up to Berlin and effectively cut off the North German Confederation from its southern allies. However, once they crossed the Prussian border, they immediately got punched back, and they have been retreating ever since. So then we come to September 1st, 1870. General Helmut von Moltke and the 3rd and 4th Prussian armies deal the finishing blow to the French Empire. So, from a Prussian royal headquarters on a hillside situated near the village of Frenois, Prussian King Wilhelm I, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, and General von Moltke watch as their forces encircle the French in the obsolete 17th century fortress of Sedan. As they encircle the French here, they have 222 infantry battalions, 186 cavalry squadrons that total to 250,000 troops, while also being accompanied by 774 artillery weapons, which surround this small, insignificant town. And as he watches on, von Moltke reportedly remarks,
"Now we have them in the mousetrap."
Tucked away in this small town is the French army of Chalons, which numbers at around 130,000 and is about half of the French standing army at this time. We'll get to where the other half of that army is in just a minute. But this half is commanded by Marshal Patrice de Marmont and, believe it or not, the French Emperor himself, Napoleon III. Now, this group of the army was actually going to rescue the second half of the French standing army, who, since August 19th, have been besieged in the city of Metz to the southeast, but were cut off and had to retreat into the town of Sedan. So, at the fortress of Metz is the French Army of the Rhine, which is under the command of Francois Baizan, and have, again, as I said, been there since August 19th after they were defeated at the Battle of Gravelines on August 18th. This half of the French standing army numbers at a little over 150,000 troops, and they are surrounded in Metz initially by around 168,000 Prussian troops, but once September comes, that number jumps up to 197,000. When they had the Army of the Rhine besieged in Metz, when they were looking at the situation, Metz was so heavily defended with artillery and siege guns that it was implausible for the Germans to attempt to take the city using artillery. So they decide that they're going to starve the city into submission. Once the city realizes this, they look at their provisions and realize they only have enough food to last 41 days. So essentially, the entire French army is cut in two and are besieged in two separate locations. One is this small, insignificant town that has no strategic value whatsoever, and the other is this heavily fortified city. And this all comes about because the French had no plan going into this war. They had no plan for offense other than the Emperor's plan of crossing the Rhine and then going up to Berlin, which then is not fleshed out at all because you know where Berlin is. It's essentially in the middle of Germany. So he just thought he would waltz in and then cut his way all the way up into the heart of Germany and take Berlin, which was just idiotic. I also want to note a little bit of a side quest to this happening a little southeast of Metz in the town of Strasbourg. Hopefully I got that right. I don't speak German, or I guess that's French, but you're going to hear a lot of that during this episode. Anyways, there's a little bit of a side quest going on in this town because Strasbourg is one of the strongest and most well-defended cities in France that had no strategic value at this time for the war because of its location. But the Prussians decided to attack it anyway due to its historical significance. The city once belonged to the Holy Roman Empire from the 10th century until it was integrated into France by King Louis XIV in 1681. So they send a squadron of the Prussian army under General August von Voda to capture the city. This siege is going to be very important for understanding an event that happens later in the war. So the Germans get to the city, they cut off the railway and telegraph lines, which isolates the city's 85,000 civilians and 15,000 soldiers. The French were not prepared for an attack at all. While he's weighing his options, Prussian General August von Voda wants the French to capitulate quickly. So once the Prussians are set up on the outskirts of the city, he asks the French garrison commander, who is Lieutenant General Jean-Jacques Ulrich, if he wants to capitulate. Ulrich refuses. He says, under no circumstances will we let you have this city. So von Voda says, fuck it, and just starts raining hell upon this entire city. They bomb the fuck out of this entire city. I'm going to put up a picture here of the aftermath of the bombing, and it is just decimated. This bombing goes on from August 14th until the Prussians literally run out of bombardment ammunition around the 26th. So it's around 2 weeks of constant bombing that destroy this city. Once that ammunition begins running low, they set up trench parallels, and bit by bit, they'll move from one trench up, dig another trench, stay there, and then move up again, new trench, and they are easily defeating any of the counterattacks that the French are throwing their way, while also utilizing concentrated bombardments to destroy specific fortifications with their remaining bombardment ammunition. So, anyways, we've been jumping around a little bit. Let's get back to the Battle of Sedan. So, September 1st, 1870, the army of Chalons is encircled in this small insignificant town. Like we said, they are led by MacMahon and the French Emperor himself, Napoleon III, and they are fucked. During this day, the Emperor himself was actually riding around the battlefield trying to get hit by artillery or a bullet or a ricochet bullet or anything so he could die in combat, because he knew that there was no escaping this fight, and that if he wanted to live to see the end of it, he needed to surrender. So, from the top of the fortress, he raises a white flag. The Prussians send a representative to investigate the situation, and they return with French General André Charles Victor Rail, hopefully I got that right, to deliver a handwritten letter of surrender to the Prussian leaders at the Royal HQ, which King Wilhelm I and Otto von Bismarck read and accept. The following day, on September 2nd, the downfall of the Second French Empire is sealed when the acting commander of the French forces, General Emmanuel Felix de Wimpin, signed the surrender papers at 11:30. Prussians took 80,000 French troops as prisoners, including Emperor Napoleon III, which, when that reaches Paris the following day, once again, the French are in an uproar. They lose it because, as his wife, Empress Eugénie de Montijo, reacts, quote, "No, an emperor does not capitulate. He is dead. They are trying to hide it from me. Why didn't he kill himself? Doesn't he know he has dishonored himself?" That is widespread throughout the entirety of the Parisian capital and the countryside of France. Every single town is shocked that their emperor, the nephew of the most powerful conqueror possibly in history, just surrendered to an opponent that they thought was nothing. It just rattles them to their core. Now, Eugénie has a situation for herself. Once she hears this news, she realizes that she may meet the same fate as Marie Antoinette in 1793, which is that the French people, the Parisians, they are going to revolt. And she was right in thinking that, because that's absolutely what they do. She flees the city for England, And as she is leaving, protesters storm the imperial palace. There is a bloodless revolution led by the trio of Jules Favre, who is a moderate liberal, Leon Gambetta, who is a leftist lawyer, and General Louis-Jules Truchot, who proclaim to the people of Paris that they have established a government of national defense and proclaim the French Third Republic. Now, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck had hoped to strike a peace deal soon after the Sedan affair. However, he lacked a legitimate French authority with whom to negotiate, because the imprisoned emperor and exiled empress did not abdicate their thrones, and the remaining French forces were still bound by an oath of allegiance to the collapsed imperial government. So the Germans didn't see the government of national defense as a legitimate French authority to negotiate with. So they get together and the new republic proposes an honorable peace and war reparations, but that doesn't satisfy the Prussians. The Prussians demand the annexation of Alsace and parts of Lorraine, which are provinces on the eastern edge of France that border Prussia. In response, the French Republic would renew the declaration of war on September 6th, with politician Jules Favre declaring that France would not, quote, yield an inch of its territory nor a stone of its fortresses. Now, since most of the French forces were either besieged in Metz or in German captivity, the Republic had to call on the civilian nationalists to join the fight, to rid their motherland of the invading Prussian horde in a, and I'm gonna butcher this, guerre à outrance, or an all-out war. While researching this, I heard this from a few different historians that this is the first time that a governing body had ever declared an all-out war, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is a war to the death. The French are going to fight until they either win or the French people are erased from the earth. Pretty similar to the Germans about 60 years later. So, the remaining trained troops that they have begin positioning themselves in Paris. And by September 16th, the Republic had assembled an army of 400,000 soldiers that are primarily composed of inexperienced, poorly trained conscripts. The French also began to fortify the Parisian capital. They move all of the farm animals from the surrounding area into the metropolis, which provides 80 days worth of food on reserve for the entire city. Now, beyond the 33 kilometers of defensive walls that surround the Parisian capital, the 3rd and 4th Prussian armies have arrived at the French capital after a 2-week trek with a force of 240,000. These troops, most of them, are the troops from the Battle of Sedan. These are, experienced soldiers. They have seen combat, they have won in combat, and they are looking out at the capital of their enemy and a superior army that is made up of less superior, in terms of training, soldiers. So the Prussians have a bit of a dilemma on their hands. They could do one of two things. They could storm the city, which would also require a few prerequisite stormings of the 16 forts that surround it. Or Helmut von Moltke can order his forces to encircle the capital and starve their opponents, along with the 2 million Parisians, into surrender. He presented this idea to the Prussian higher-ups, who are a little weary of it. They say, I don't know if we want to wait that long, you should just shell the city. And the reason they didn't want to wait that long is because even though the war had already been 6 months, the world had been watching it and they didn't want any outside forces getting involved. They didn't want the British getting involved and besieging a city and starving the people. They thought would certainly get the attention of outside foreign forces. So they say, I don't know, maybe just shell the city. Von Moltke flat out declines. He doesn't want to shell the city because he doesn't want to cause civilian deaths, which will undoubtedly lead to global condemnation befalling the Prussians. He has to pick the lesser of two evils and the less destructive of two evils and chooses to besiege the city. he is confident that the French will capitulate from a simple encirclement, which is a belief not shared by King Wilhelm. Nevertheless, he goes through with it. He orders his troops to surround the city, and the siege of Paris begins on September 19th, 1870. The siege of Paris is, in my opinion, the most interesting part of this entire war. And if you know me, you know that I love the grim aspects of history. I love the brutality of history. I believe that oftentimes we sanitize our retelling of history as to not offend or disturb anybody that is learning it, which could be good if you're teaching kids, but if you're teaching adults, I think it's a real detriment to their knowledge and to our recognition of the past as we move into the future. And the Siege of Paris is a really brutal time in the history of Paris and France as a country. It's really difficult for us in the 21st century to envision what life in a besieged city would be like, because we have so many avenues of communication, primarily due to the internet. But this is 1870. There is no internet, there is no radio, there is paper, and there is telegraph. That's it. So when the Germans decide to besiege Paris, one of the first things they do is either capture or destroy all of the train depots that lead in and out of the city. Then they hunt down and sever all of the underground telegraph lines that connect the city to the outside world. Once that's accomplished, life in the French capital becomes a shadow of its former self. This once captivating symbol of social elegance and modern innovation is now descending into a downtrodden metropolis that is marked by silence and despair and seclusion and profound suffering. There's a quote from a professor at the École de Médecine. Hopefully I got that right. But his name is Victor Desplats. Hopefully I got that right too. Don't know, I don't speak French, even though I took it for 2 years in high school. Anyways, there's a quote from him, and he, when relaying the state of Paris as it is cut off from the rest of the world and the siege conditions begin to set in, he describes, quote,
You can't imagine the condition of the physiognomy of Paris and its environs. It's no longer that elegant city, glamorous and agitated. The stores were closed, the streets deserted, and silent.
It's not surprising to note that at this time, Paris, along with other cities like London and New York, had really strict social classes. There was the rich, there was the working class, there was the poor. And as these siege conditions began to set in, those were completely wiped away. And everything became a product of the war. All of the infamous financial districts with all these beautiful shops of jewelry became holding grounds for troops and weapons. And it completely transformed the City of Lights. Eventually, the only way to escape or relay communications to the rest of France was by a hot air balloon or carrier pigeons. That is how cut off Paris is from the rest of the world, is they need to utilize carrier pigeons just to communicate with the rest of their country. Now, outside of the city walls, there are periodical skirmishes between the French and the Germans, particularly around the fortifications that surround the city, but there's a lot of downtime in between these skirmishes. During that downtime, as well as for units that aren't in active combat, the soldiers become very prone to boredom. Another thing they become prone to is their own vices. These soldiers had been away from their families for about 8 weeks now, and the nightlife of Paris begins to flood into their camps. And that is the French prostitutes. And obviously, them being lonely and bored, they indulge. And this becomes a huge problem for the German high command. Anybody that is caught fraternizing with any of these prostitutes are arrested, and the German High Command eventually begins these rigorous PT exercises to try and transform the soldiers' pent-up sexual energy into building up their bodies and making them better soldiers, which not sure if that really works, but, you know. For the civilians inside of Paris, things are going to continue going downhill, and the next barrel at their feet is thrown on October 27th. On that day, any saving grace the Parisians had was subdued when the besieged and starving army of the Rhine capitulated at Metz. If you've been paying attention, you'll realize that we are now in October, and I said that the Army of the Rhine and the entire city of Metz, which had 70,000 civilians, only had enough provisions to last them 41 days. This siege has been going on for 2 months, so it has been absolute hell in the city of Metz. There have been riots among the starving army and the city's residents, and on October 20th, the food provisions of the fortress ran out completely. The Army of the Rhine tried to keep going by sustaining themselves on the flesh of the 20,000 horses within the city, but they were consuming them at a rate of 1,000 horses per day. And it just was not plausible. So Commander Francois Bazin surrendered the city on October 27th, ending the siege at 2 months, 1 week, and 1 day. This was devastating for the Parisians because they had been holding out for this last month, thinking if the Army of the Rhine can just break out of Metz and defeat the Prussians that surround them there, they will march up to Paris and they will relieve us of this siege and we will be saved. And that doesn't happen. And it's not the only terrible thing that befalls the Parisians at this time, because just as the Army of the Rhine capitulates at Metz, an unusually freezing winter sets in at the close of October, and the city's rations begin to dwindle. During this winter, temperatures are going to reach as low as 14 degrees Fahrenheit at night, and the German soldiers are not prepared for winter conditions at all. So you put yourself in the mind of one of these soldiers. There is sporadic fighting. It's not everyday fighting. There are days you're just sitting at camp doing nothing, and you're left shivering in these brutal temperatures in a foreign land. As the months roll on, you thought you'd be home by now. You're looking at Paris, and there is still no surrender. And you are just thinking, when am I going to see my family again? And this is where the siege of Paris gets really gritty and shows the true fighting spirit of the French. Today, the French get a lot of flack as being weak and inefficient for their performance in World War II. Obviously, just letting the Germans waltz right into their country and Paris and take them over. But the French are badass. The French are as tough as they come. This is the country of Napoleon we're talking about. You know, this is a country of conquerors. And the civilians take after their rulers. So as the hunger starts to set in, they resort to different avenues of sustenance. They first begin by killing and eating the horses within the city. Once the horses ran out, if you were a Parisian civilian, you would be walking the streets and lining the alleyways and streets of this glorious bastion of civilization is now wet markets where butchers are selling dog and cat meat. And then once they run out, by mid-November, they turn to rats. So if you are a 10-year-old kid with a parent who was fortunate enough to catch a rat in the alleyway behind your house, that's what you're eating for dinner. And you think that's disgusting until you're reminded of the time you're living in, along with every city in the world at this time, but especially in besieged Paris. Disease is rampant, specifically dysentery and typhoid. These Parisians are doing anything to survive. They're staying vigilant. They're eating whatever they can get their hands on. But once all of the fresh meat in the city runs out, they turn their attention to the most unique resource for meat in the city. And that is housed within the city's zoo. Some of the most interesting articles of the Siege of Paris are almost like a hand reaching out through the dark, trying to connect besieged Paris to the pre-siege refinement of the city. And that takes form in these hotel restaurant menus during Christmas. If you were lucky enough and wealthy enough to go to a hotel or a restaurant for a meal, this is the type of meals you would see on the menu. Donkey head, elephant soup, roast camel, kangaroo stew, cat stew with mushrooms, bear ribs, dog cutlets, and dog legs with a side of baby rats. That last one is the most outrageous dish I have ever heard of, but that's what the Parisians were eating. If you were wealthy enough to go to a restaurant during the siege, that was their will to survive and to continue their upper class way of life during these wretched conditions. But for the lower classes, since you couldn't get your hands on meat anymore, and if you did, it was like you were blessed by the heavens. All you had to eat was bread, wine, and coffee. Now, back in Versailles, the unwavering and almost inhuman resilience of the Parisians is beginning to have an effect on the German leadership's patience. They've been besieging the city for around 4 months now, and they see no end in sight. They have soldiers on the front lines that are bored by a lack of combat, shivering in freezing temperatures, and the Parisian morale has remained generally unchanged. So now they must decide what the next steps will be. And at the insistence of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, German artillery begins raining down upon Paris. 12,000 shells were fired into the starved French capital for 3 weeks. However, these were not strategic shellings. Many of the shells fell in the poorer districts of France. They didn't want to destroy any locations of importance within the city because they didn't want to garner any international condemnation. They didn't want to destroy art or anything that was seen as landmarks of humanity and civilization. Interestingly, the bombardment actually killed more Germans than it did Frenchmen, since French snipers could easily pick off German artillerymen as they loaded the artillery. So, putting ourselves back in the minds of the Parisians, if you are in the middle class, you are now eating sporadically if you can find food, but you're also now not sleeping because throughout the night, all you hear is shells being dropped upon your city. So now you're starving and you can't sleep, but somehow you find the will to keep going and to hope that this siege will be broken and that France will be saved somehow. And if you're on the poorer end of the social spectrum, you're going through all those things too, but now it's right outside your door. Now you are trying to sleep and there is a shell that blasts through the buildings right down the street from you. But again, you're still finding that will to keep fighting and keep hoping that you will be saved. The only thing that is battering your morale and will truly be the downfall of your valiant Parisian spirit is hunger and disease. It's important to note too, when I am saying that these Parisians are hoping that they will be relieved of this siege by outside forces that come in to save them, where are those forces coming from? And one of the most interesting stories that comes from the siege of Paris is the flight of Léon Gambetta. Gambetta, we mentioned previously, was one of the three men that set up the government of national defense and proclaimed the Third French Republic. Gambetta knew that the siege had to be broken, so with the help of some of his countrymen, he boarded a hot air balloon and rose into the skies of Paris and was able to pass over the German lines, avoiding German bullets and anti-aircraft guns that were trying to take him down, and then reaches the Loire Valley and begins setting up small guerrilla armies to open up a new front in the east. This doesn't really go anywhere, though. You know, there's just, it's this vain hope to continue the fighting and try to defeat the Germans who have you beat. But it again speaks to the vigilance and indomitable spirit of the French to continue fighting in any way they can and never give in and never give up. And although the civilians feel that way, the government doesn't. So, as we roll into 1871, the German leadership and the princes begin to debate the formation of the new German Empire. And what is undoubtedly the most stressful debate is a war of semantics over the title of the impending German Reich. Bismarck proposes revitalizing the title of emperor, which is Kaiser, which is an idea that King Wilhelm was reluctant to accept. Kaiser Wilhelm's idea is that if that designation were to be used, he favored the title Kaiser of Germany. Conversely, Bismarck favored German Kaiser, and it seems like not much of a difference, but the reason why it was such a heated debate is explained by Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm, who is going to be the future Kaiser and the father of Kaiser Wilhelm II, who is the German emperor during World War I. So he wrote, quote,
Bismarck sought to prove that the expression Kaiser von Deutschland meant a territorial power which we did not possess of the Reich at all, whereas Deutsche Kaiser, on the other hand, was the natural consequence of the former Imperator Romanis.
So ultimately, Bismarck does what he does best, and he manipulates the German princes into pressing his version of the title upon the Prussian king. At noon on January 18th, 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, which, interesting fact, is soaked with blood. The floors have blood stains everywhere because it had been used as a military hospital. And then they decided, since, this is such an elaborate room and so important to the history of Imperial France and history of France as a whole, we are going to proclaim our empire here. So they move all of the hurt soldiers out of the room. They move all of the nursing beds out of the room, but they don't clean the floors. So it is just soaked with blood. And in this room, the German Empire, or the Second German Reich, was proclaimed, with Prussian King Wilhelm crowned German Kaiser. Now, you may wonder, why did I say Second German Reich? The First German Reich was the Holy Roman Empire, which circles into this proclamation because when this event happens, Kaiser Wilhelm was not a very happy camper. That's for two reasons. Number one is because obviously he didn't want this position. He was a staunch supporter of the Prussian noble lineage and the Prussian throne, and he did not want that to be dissolved by taking this throne. The second reason is because when they were planning out this new empire, they decided that they were going to stick with the current colors of black, white, and red, instead of going back to the colors of the Holy Roman Empire, which is black, red, and gold, and also the current colors of Germany today. So he was pissed off. And the event itself didn't really go that well. Kaiser Wilhelm was crowned, and he really did not acknowledge Chancellor Otto von Bismarck at all, who is the reason that this unification of Germany is happening in the first place. There are different accounts of this event. People say it was wonderful and magnificent, and other people say this was kind of like a shit show that was just thrown together and not really well coordinated and just did not feel as grand as it should have been. Nevertheless, the German Empire was proclaimed. Germany was unified, they were one cohesive unit, and 10 days later, hostilities would end with the Armistice of Versailles. However, the agony of defeat for the French was not over yet. Once the armistice had been signed, and we had rolled into the month of February in 1871, Paris was a boiling pot. It was described as, quote, a war-battered, highly politicized population that seethed with anger and frustration at the betrayal it felt as its government's ignominious surrender, unquote. And this is going to lead to a series of revolutions and an event known as the Paris Commune. And I'm not going to cover that in this episode. I might cover it in the future at some point. But for now, we're just going to stick to the war itself. But remember that quote, because as we move forward here, it's going to ring true in the events that take place. The dagger of humiliation was plunged into their national pride on March 1st, when the Kaiser held a victory parade featuring 30,000 German troops marching through the streets of Paris. There are pictures of this march that are just unbelievable. The size and magnitude. It just destroyed the pride of the Frenchmen. And unfortunately, the French took their anger out on some of their own people, specifically the French women. There are accounts that groups of men around Paris would beat and strip Parisian women who they accused of flirting with the German soldiers while they passed by during the parade. And it was an ugly day. On May 10th, 1871, the final terms of peace were signed in Frankfurt. Germany annexed Alsace and parts of Lorraine, while France agreed to pay 5 billion francs in war reparations, with a caveat that until the reparations are paid in full, German troops would occupy Paris, and those troops would not leave the Parisian capital for another 2 years. So that is the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871. Again, this is a war that I had just been learning about. I had never really thought of what Germany's origin story was. I knew that they were once Prussia, but I didn't know how they became Germany, and the country that changed the world in the worst possible way. This war has a direct line of consequence that spans 40 years leading to World War I. It is a defeat that French men and women for 2 generations think about constantly. It is actually Leon Gambetta, the guy we mentioned earlier, who was one of the 3 men to proclaim the government of national defense and the Third French Republic. He is quoted as stating, "Think of it always, speak of it never," when referring to the lost territory of Alsace and Lorraine and the just humiliating defeat of the French Empire. It is such a major influence in the outbreak of World War I that I cannot believe I had never heard about. And I couldn't start talking about the outbreak of World War I without talking about this war, because this is the war that made Germany. And it is the war that fueled the resentment of the French people towards the Germans. You know, propaganda from World War I, from both France and England during World War I. The Germans are called Huns, they're barbarians, they are monsters. And this has a basis in that view of them, is this brutal beatdown of one of the world powers and how humiliated they made the French feel. The French are going to internalize that humiliation. They're going to turn it into hate, and they are going to hold on to it for 40 years until the time is right. And that opportunity is going to come from a bullet fired by an insignificant 20-year-old Bosnian Serb at an heir presumptive of one of the largest and most powerful empires of the early 20th century in Sarajevo in June of 1914.